Our final speaker that we have for us this morning in this first session on Wednesday, the 10th of May, is the fabulous Namali, who is dialing into us from Australia. Namali, thank you so much for having been here through the entirety of the session. I think it's going to be great to hear your thoughts and your feelings with regards to what we've heard today. But do you want to introduce yourself to everybody who is on the session, and then we can get cracking with some questions? So Namali, over to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'm Namali Mackay. I'm the Managing Director of the Critical Minerals Association Australia, which Jeff Townsend, who you've just heard from, founded both in the UK and here in Australia. And we have been up and running in Australia for just only about 6 months now. But what's really interesting about your topic, Sarah, about the criticality of trust, is that we've entered the market here in Australia, or started up, I would say, as some kind of industry disruptor. So, Australia has a very strong mining history, as you all know. And we've come in as a critical minerals association, and there wasn't one, which is quite surprising already in Australia. And what we found is that actually all of these critical minerals companies were interspersed with coal and gold and, associations that represented the whole of mining. So we've come in and sort of disrupted that model and said, here we are, we're in a group of companies that we're pulling together, all about critical minerals. We're powering the new sort of energy revolution. We're not fossil fuel based. We have ethical and responsible practices, and that's really kind of brought up a bit of angst, I would say, in the sort of mining industry, because what's happened is it's had a lot of companies question, okay, well, where do we sit on this spectrum? What's our track record? And we're being fussy about who we take on as a result, because it's not a country, I guess, like the UK, where there's not a lot of mining in comparison to Australia. So, we just have the entire spectrum. And so our whole mission is entirely based on being able to build trust and credibility, and really to kind of reposition the industry and the country. And it's been fascinating listening to everybody else, because I guess what's interesting is that Australia's in this very unique position at the moment, where we just have a huge amount of critical minerals at our disposal in terms of supply, but it's all in the ground. And to get it out, as we know, is a massive challenge in the time frame. So we have this huge demand at your end of the world, banging on the door, and then we just simply can't get it out in time and get it out responsibly. And so we're facing a huge number of, I would say, trust issues, and they range from things like ESG is a big one, and greenwashing. Greenwashing is fundamentally an undermining of trust, is it not? And so we're looking at companies sometimes, want to join the association to give themselves a green tick, because we do value ESG so highly. And, we have a lot of challenge around, well, what are you actually doing? And, you and I will be talking tomorrow on our webinar about ESG and, about Australia, are we a trustworthy, environmentally sustainable and social? Do we adhere in the way that we say? But, I could keep going on, but I'll just stop there as an intro.
No, I think that's fascinating. So, Namali, where you were maybe beginning to tiptoe into, is Australia trustworthy? Is that what you were going for, or is the CMA Australia trustworthy?
Well, that's a really good question. I think I would answer yes to both of those in different spheres. I think we are having, as CMA Australia, we have to demonstrate our own credibility in this space. And there's, when you hold up such high, big values as your core principle, there's a massive sort of onus on you to uphold that and not undermine trust as you're going along. So, it's the responsibilities on us to vet who we take in, what we say. There's a big trust, I guess, responsibility of trust on us, but also your point about Australia, that is a whole separate issue. Because Australia is not, we don't have child labour. We have a very good governance structure. You could easily assume, I guess, that we are a very responsible, we tick all of the ESG boxes. But, you've also seen, Rio Tinto blowing up the occasional cave, and we have very, very big, deeply entrenched Indigenous First Nations people issues where a lot of the mining of critical minerals and other minerals happens on Indigenous ground. We have some major, major challenges. And they're all fundamentally, I would say, sort of trust-based.
And with that, Namali, because again, in terms of almost like the brand or the persona of Australia out to the world, it is quite different, I think, having spent lots of time working and living in Australia itself. And just to dive into those areas of trust, especially with regards to, I guess, changing relationships and respect, perhaps, with regards to Indigenous peoples. Do you want to describe a bit more with regards to what's been, I guess, changing in Australia, even over just the last few years?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is really interesting because I've been away from Australia for a long time and only just returned. I've been in the UK for my sins, and I'm back. And, just something as simple as acknowledging the country, that has now become a very common practice I would only say in the last 5 years or so, that we acknowledge the Aboriginal ground on which we stand before we speak or have a meeting or a gathering, and it's become woven into the culture. I mean, that's just a very peripheral example, but we have a partner or Indigenous partner organization that we consult with, and one of the things that they are trying to do is, rather than by having Indigenous buy-in into mining operations by having them, tick various boxes, their whole concept is about, why don't you give us some ownership of this operation? Whether it's not just about just having a few Indigenous people employed or giving them a vehicle or whatever handout there is. It's about creating some kind of ownership in the project that belongs to the Indigenous people as well. I mean, that's just one example. And that conversation would never have happened a long time ago, or even recently. So it is definitely changing. And I think also at your end of the world, consumers are demanding that. And that has flowed, it's flowed through the supply chain, and that's forced some of this conversation and some of this change, which is great. It's a good thing. Yeah.
And I guess with that, also building on some of the earlier conversations we had today, is maybe the consumer end or the end user part of the world. When I was thinking about Olivia's fantastic map that she had, is saying, hey, we want all these credentials, but we're not necessarily willing to pay for it. Are you seeing any of that differentiation in the market that Paul was referring to earlier, where if you can prove that you've managed to find and extract and process this material in a responsible manner, is there a premium with regards to that, or is that not quite there yet?
So this is crucial. It's not quite there yet. And I think that is the challenge that we face here in having suppliers and extractors and operators at the upstream end actually buy into being responsible, because at the end of the day, price and money dictates everything. And so you know, they're not seeing that coming down the chain yet. And so I think it's at this stage, it's very much an investment in the future, in an investment in knowing that that premium will come. But also there's a whole group of miners who don't believe that premium is there. So there's all of that sort of diverse set of views as well to contend with.
And so with this, I don't know, maybe I can bring Jeff into the conversation. Because Jeff, having established the Critical Minerals Association, firstly here in the UK, but then also maybe looking at the differentiation between what does it look like from a UK context compared to an Australian context, and what Namali's just been describing now, obviously, is the Australian context. And so there's slightly different needs, demands, mechanisms through which to create that trust. Jeff, do you have any comments on that?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we set up the associations as different entities. So CMA Australia is there to promote Australian companies and the country, because it's a different place to the UK. So technically, CMA UK and CMA Australia are in competition with each other, but we're friends, so it's all good. Look, it's not. There's no horses for courses. It's slightly different everywhere you go, and there are different, even to the extent of issues. The way the issues play out can be completely different, even within a single country, let alone between countries. So, Cornwall generally pro mining. Buckinghamshire, where there is nothing to mine apart from clag and mud, very anti-mining. And then, but Australia has a history of mining, and even the average man down the pub can tell you about mining. It's an interesting one, and the way that you engage and the way that you have to operate is different, and that's why we were very lucky when Namali said to me that she was going back to Australia. I said, well, if you don't have a job, I've got a challenge for you. And thankfully, she took it on, because I don't know anyone else who could do such a good job.
Thank you very much for that, Jeff. So Namali, coming back to yourself, Jeff mentioned something interesting there, where from a UK perspective, and again, this can be backed up, but again, there are assumptions in here. If it's a part of the country where there is a history of mining and there is mining, people are generally going, okay, yeah, we understand it. Perhaps we're a bit more pro. Whereas if you go to other parts of the country where there is no mining, then you get more of an anti-mining vibe. I think, Jeff, that's what you were putting on the table there. From an Australian perspective, Namali, where, let's face it, there is a lot more mining, but of course the land mass is much bigger than what we have in the UK. Do you see that? And from a kind of, do people like mining or don't like mining, or holding mining to account? What does that look like in Australia?
Well, I think that's changing, because compared to the UK, for example, the culture of mining is very much embedded, in the economy, in the, in the sort of fabric of society here. But generationally, that's really shifting. And I think, your millennials and others who are now the consumers are not willing to, they just have a different set of values that don't fit with traditional mining. And that's very much what we're seeing the world over, but the same here, I would say. And we've got a whole set of unique issues as well, in terms of we are located in Asia, and our biggest trading partner is also the biggest consumer of our critical minerals, that being China. And I think we had, I don't know what the right set of words are, but had to have a really good look in the mirror during the time when China imposed trade sanctions on Australia, and our whole way of operating has had to be restructured, I guess. And this is all, again, another function of trust, and lack of trust. And there's a whole raft of issues around how do we manage that relationship? How do we manage our critical mineral supply chain through the majority of Australian critical minerals companies trade with China. That's their next port of call, and that's very understandable. So, there's a lot of dynamic of change going on there.
So with that, Namali, do you see that in terms of, say, the US saying, okay, we need to make sure that we've got security of supply that doesn't rely on that supply chain going through China, similar rhetoric, for example, from Europe, etc. Are you seeing that impact on Australia with regards to the relationship between Australia and China, and then also perhaps the opportunity with regards to Australia and some of those other nations? Is that something where we're seeing some kind of really big tensions or stresses being put on the supply chains at the moment, both from a threat but also an opportunity perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that supply chain tension and actual practical problems that we faced a couple of years ago has really brought home the fact that we need to have a conversation about not putting all our eggs in one basket, which is kind of what the CMA is about. And I'll let Jeff come in a minute. But what's interesting is, while we're having that conversation up here about it, in practice, a lot of critical minerals companies have no choice but to trade with China. So there's this disconnect, there's a tension. And as I was saying earlier on, Australia is now pushing to develop its midstream so that we are less reliant on other countries in that sort of way. But the timing of this, it just is not likely to work, in terms of the demand. And so how do we handle that? And, I'll hand over to you, Jeff, because I know you will have something to say here.
Cheers, Namali. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you just look at the international collaborator or engagement. So the UK wants to build its midstream as well. And so it goes to Australia and it says, right, we'd like your minerals, please. We'd like to have a relationship with you. And the Aussie government doesn't necessarily trust the UK government, A, to deliver that, but B, to also not try and push a dig and ship approach. So Australia wants to build a midstream. The UK wants to build a midstream. So you're both going after the same thing. In reality, you need each other, but there's a lack of trust because both are so desperate to develop their own and capture that economic benefit as well. I feel sorry for Australia, who, you just look at what happened with Bali a year ago. Was it a year ago? 18 months ago. You're trying to create an alternative supply chain, but at the same time you can get punished relatively easy, which doesn't make it a beneficial position to be in. Although having an Australian godfather, they can be quite stubborn Aussies, so I think they'll be fine.
There we go. Lovely. You're going to be fine because Jeff said that that's the case.
Yeah, well, that's lucky, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, you made the point, Sarah, about the US. And yeah, I mean, this is what, Jeff, step in when you want to, but this is what we're doing in the critical minerals associations of the US and the UK and Australia and Canada as well, just trying to have that conversation between like-minded countries, which I guess mirrors, the sentiment that the MSP has started to discuss. Yeah.
I mean, we would love the critical minerals associations to join together through our new body, CMIA, Critical Minerals International Alliance. Lots of different acronyms. But why is that important? Because at the moment you've got one side of the coin, which is a government and political team of nations, like-minded nations, but they don't have an industrial counterpart to that. So what we're trying to build is an industrial counterpart to that, so where you can get industry to say, okay, these are the issues, this is actually what needs to happen at a global level. We'll let the domestic associations scrap it out between themselves. It's the right thing to do, but there are certain global issues that need to be dealt with, whether that's on things from ESG, vitally important, through to how do you transport waste to build a circular economy, through to simple things like let's not let geopolitics get in the way of meeting net zero agendas.
So with that, what I'm going to do is first to say thank you so much, Namali, for joining us all the way from Australia and really giving us that Australian insight with regards to some of these aspects of the challenges that we face. So Namali, thank you so much. Round of applause for the wonderful Namali. But